6 weeks after the funeral, she still could not eat a full meal. Not because of sadness in the way people mean it when they say someone has lost their appetite from a broken heart. Something more specific was happening. Every time she sat down to eat, her stomach tightened the way it does before a fall, and the food sat there, undigested, for hours. Her doctor ran blood tests. Everything came back normal. Nothing was wrong with her stomach. And yet something was clearly wrong with her stomach. That contradiction is the subject of this video. Because grief does not stay in the part of you that thinks. It moves down, through a nerve thicker than your thumb, into a second nervous system most people do not know they have. And once it arrives there, it does not leave quietly. It has a mechanism. And the mechanism is why a perfectly healthy gut can stop behaving like one. In the 1990s, a gastroenterologist named Dr. Michael Gershon at Columbia University published findings that forced a quiet revision of human anatomy textbooks. The digestive tract, he showed, contains its own independent nervous system embedded in its walls, containing somewhere between 200 million and 600 million neurons. To put that in perspective, that is more neurons than exist in the spinal cord. He called it the enteric nervous system, and the name that stuck in public language was the second brain, though Gershon himself preferred a more precise term, a nervous system that can function, make local decisions, and generate its own reflexes without a single signal from the brain in your skull. Separately, researchers at UCLA, led by Dr. Emran Mayer, spent 2 decades mapping what is now called the gut-brain axis, publishing in journals including Nature Reviews, Gastroenterology, and Hepatology. Their data is consistent. Psychological states measurably alter gut motility, gut permeability, and the composition of the bacteria living inside it, often within days, not months. None of this is metaphor. It is wiring. And bereavement researcher Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor at the University of Arizona has spent her career documenting what grief does to the body, using the same instruments cardiologists and immunologists use elsewhere. What follows is what those instruments found when they were pointed at the gut. Begin with the wire itself. The vagus nerve leaves the base of your skull and travels down through the neck, past the heart, through the diaphragm, and terminates in branches that wrap around your stomach and intestines like roots around a stone. It carries information in both directions, but the traffic is asymmetric. Roughly 80% of vagal fibers carry signals upward, from gut to brain, not downward. Your gut is not simply receiving instructions from your skull, it is reporting to it, constantly, on a channel that runs mostly one way. This is why the felt experience of grief so often locates itself not in the head, but in the torso. The nerve is there. The wiring did not evolve to handle the specific signal of permanent absence, but it responds to it anyway, because grief activates the same threat detection circuitry that the vagus nerve was built to monitor. Under acute stress, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis releases cortisol in sustained elevated waves rather than the brief spikes seen in ordinary stress. Cortisol's job, evolutionarily, is short-term mobilization. It diverts blood flow toward muscles and away from digestion, on the assumption that whatever caused the stress will be resolved quickly, one way or another. Grief does not resolve quickly, so the cortisol keeps arriving, day after day, and the gut keeps deprioritizing itself in favor of a threat that never completes. Studies published in Psychoneuroendocrinology on prolonged bereavement found measurably elevated cortisol profiles in widowed subjects that persisted for months. With blunted morning cortisol response, a pattern associated in separate research with increased intestinal permeability, sometimes described informally as leaky gut. The tight junctions between intestinal cells, which under normal conditions form a controlled barrier, loosen under chronic cortisol exposure. Bacterial fragments that should stay inside the intestine begin crossing into the bloodstream in small amounts, triggering low-grade systemic inflammation. This is mechanistically plausible and supported by animal models and a growing body of human data, though the precise dose-response curve in human grief specifically is still being mapped. What is clinically confirmed is the inflammatory marker itself. Interleukin-6, a cytokine associated with this kind of gut-driven inflammation, is consistently elevated in bereaved populations studied by researchers, including Dr. Janice Kiecolt-Glaser at Ohio State University. If this is the part of grief that lives in your body and nobody warned you about, you are not alone in not knowing it. I have spent months building something called What Feynman Knew About Grief, a companion resource that walks through exactly this kind of evidence in a format you can return to. The link is in the pinned comment below. Stay with me though, because the part of this that surprised even the researchers studying it is still ahead. What happens to the bacteria living inside you, the ones that were never yours to begin with, when the person you love disappears? The human gut hosts an estimated 38 trillion bacterial cells, a population roughly equal to the number of human cells in your entire body. This community, the microbiome, is not a passive passenger. It produces an estimated 90 to 95% of the body's serotonin, manufactured not in the brain, but in the gut, by enterochromaffin cells, responding in part to signals from bacteria themselves. It also produces gamma-aminobutyric acid and short-chain fatty acids that influence inflammation throughout the body. Researchers studying chronic stress, including work compiled at the APC Microbiome Institute in Cork, Ireland, have repeatedly found that sustained psychological stress shifts the ratio of bacterial species in a measurable, reproducible direction. A reduction in diversity, a decline in beneficial strains such as Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium, and a relative increase in species associated with inflammation. Preliminary studies specifically on bereaved populations, smaller in scale but consistent in direction, have found this same inflammatory shift, occurring within weeks of a major loss, not months. The bacteria did not leave. They reorganized themselves in response to a chemical environment that changed the day the loss happened, because cortisol, inflammatory cytokines, and altered gut motility are all, to a bacterium, simply a different climate to adapt to. This reorganization explains a detail many bereaved people report but rarely connect to grief itself. Digestive symptoms that resemble irritable bowel syndrome, appearing for the first time in someone who never had them before, altered motility from vagal disruption, reduced microbial diversity, and increased gut permeability together produce a clinical picture that overlaps substantially with functional gastrointestinal disorder, even though the bereaved person has no structural disease. Gastroenterologists sometimes call this a brain-gut disorder, but the directionality in grief runs the other way as often as not. The gut is not malfunctioning. It is accurately reporting a state that originated somewhere else and travelled down the vagus nerve to a system that has no way of knowing the threat is not the kind it can digest its way out of. The bacteria did not abandon you. They reorganised around what arrived. What Feynman knew about grief works the same way, built to stay useful as the evidence around grief keeps getting reorganised. It is in the pinned comment below, only while this video is up. There is a separate mechanism worth naming precisely, because it explains why some people lose their appetite entirely while others develop the opposite pattern. The enteric nervous system does not run on a single signal. It runs on a balance between the sympathetic branch, which slows digestion and constricts blood vessels in the gut, and the parasympathetic branch, carried largely by the vagus nerve, which stimulates digestion, enzyme release, and motility. Acute grief in its earliest days tends to push the system's sympathetic dominant. Appetite drops, the stomach tightens, digestion slows nearly to a stop. This is measurable using heart rate variability, a metric of vagal tone that researchers including Dr. Stephen Porges at Indiana University have studied for decades. Lower heart rate variability correlates with lower vagal tone, and lower vagal tone correlates with reduced digestive enzyme secretion, slower gastric emptying, and the specific hollow nausea many bereaved people describe in the first weeks. As grief becomes chronic rather than acute, some individuals shift toward dysregulated parasympathetic activity, instead producing the opposite presentation: increased appetite, particularly for calorie-dense food, as the body's stress response chemistry begins favouring different hormonal pathways, including ghrelin, ironically nicknamed the hunger hormone, which several studies have found elevated under chronic, low-grade, unresolved stress rather than acute stress. The body does not have one grief response, it has at least two, branching from the same nerve, depending on how long the nervous system believes the threat will last. There is a third layer to this, sitting beneath both the nerve and the bacteria, and it concerns the glands most people never think about until they stop working correctly. Gastric acid secretion, controlled in part by vagal stimulation of parietal cells in the stomach lining, depends on a steady parasympathetic signal to maintain normal output. Under sympathetic dominance, that signal weakens, and stomach acid production drops below the level needed to properly break down protein and trigger the release of intrinsic factor, a substance required to absorb vitamin B12. Simultaneously, the pancreas reduces secretion of digestive enzymes, including amylase, lipase, and protease, which under normal vagal tone are released in response to food entering the stomach. With that signal blunted, food sits partially undigested for longer, fermenting rather than breaking down cleanly, which produces the bloating and discomfort many bereaved people describe and frequently misattribute to something they ate, when the more accurate explanation is something they lost. Gallbladder contraction follows the same vagal pathway, meaning bile release, necessary for digesting fat, slows in parallel. None of these glands are damaged. Each one is simply waiting for a signal that grief has quietly turned down. Here is the detail that surprised researchers studying this pattern more than any single mechanism on its own. The digestive disruption does not track the emotional timeline that grief is supposed to follow. Clinicians have long described a rough expectation that the most acute emotional pain softens somewhat within the first 6 months. The gut does not follow that schedule. In several of the smaller bereavement studies tracking gastrointestinal symptoms specifically, digestive complaints either persisted, unchanged, or, in a meaningful subset of subjects, worsened in months 4 through 8, well after friends and family had stopped checking in, on the assumption that the worst had passed. Why would a system built to respond to threat get worse only after the obvious signs of distress have started to fade? That question sat unresolved in the literature for years, and the answer, when researchers found it, came from outside gastroenterology entirely. If you are noticing your own body in any of this while you watch, that recognition is itself data, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. What Feynman knew about grief is built to sit alongside exactly this kind of recognition. The link stays in the pinned comment only while this video is up. In the 1980s, the physicist Richard Feynman spent several years consulting for Thinking Machines Corporation, working alongside Danny Hillis on a computer called the Connection Machine, a system built not on a single fast processor, but on 65,000 small, simple processors operating in parallel, each handling a tiny piece of a larger problem, none of them aware of the whole. Feynman was fascinated by this design specifically because it solved problems no single central processor could solve efficiently by distributing cognition across thousands of independent, locally acting units that together produced something resembling a unified response. The enteric nervous system is, structurally, the same architecture, built roughly 400 million years before anyone designed a computer to mimic it. Hundreds of millions of neurons, distributed through the gut wall, each processing local information, none of them individually aware of grief, together producing nausea, appetite loss, and altered motility as an emergent output of distributed processing rather than a single, centralized decision. Your gut is not relaying an order from your brain, it is running its own calculation, locally, on data your brain sent it once, and it has kept running that calculation since the day the data arrived. This reframes something that sounds at first like superstition, the idea that grief is felt in the gut, not just the head. It is not superstition, it is a description of where, anatomically, several 100 million neurons are actively processing a signal your conscious mind sent only once. The brain experienced the loss as an event. The gut is still running it as a condition. There is something almost unbearable in that, and something quietly precise. The part of you that digests food does not know the person is not coming back. It only knows that the chemical signature of sustained threat has not stopped arriving, and so it has not stopped responding, on a schedule that has nothing to do with how long it has been since the funeral, and everything to do with how long the signal keeps registering as current. This is not a flaw in the design. It is the design working exactly as built, applied to a kind of loss the design was never specifically built for, because nothing in 400 million years of nervous system evolution, anticipated the particular signal of someone who is permanently, irrevocably absent and yet still occupies a body's worth of expected presence in every system tuned to expect them. What we have been tracing today has been waiting in plain sight inside every grieving body for as long as grief has existed, and almost no one has had the instruments to name it until recently. YouTube removed our monetization on this channel and continued running ads on these videos regardless, collecting that revenue while we receive none of it. So we built what Feynman knew about grief to keep this kind of evidence reaching people without depending on a system that is actively working against the channel that produces it. If what you found here mattered to you, the link is in the description and pinned in the comments below. That is the only thing keeping this research accessible once this particular video stops being recommended. Just as the gut keeps running its calculation long after the signal that started it, this channel keeps running long after any single video stops trending. There is no instruction at the end of this, no exercise to perform, no breathing pattern to adopt, no diet to follow that will override several 100 million neurons mid-calculation. What there is, instead, is a more accurate description of what is happening inside you, which is, on its own terms, a form of company. The nausea is not betrayal. The tightness is not weakness. It is 400 million years of distributed architecture, doing precisely what it was built to do, in response to a signal it received only once, from someone who is gone, and who, as far as that signal is concerned, has not finished arriving